grounds of Wimbledon House. She made a quick circuit. Everything was exactly where it should be. Not a folded drapery out of place or a speck of sand on the hardwood floor. These were Magda's favorite moments, when the house was peaceful, and Isabel seemed just barely out of reach. Her phone chirped. The consultant for the cultural land application was canceling because of the threat of Route 1 being closed during the evacuation. Magda sighed and offered 3 dates to reschedule. So the book continues from there. We've got our main character who loves the house and loves this poet, and a hurricane coming in, and she's not leaving. So I think we were going to let people ask questions on the chat if they want. I'm going to enjoy this coconut as we
do have a question.
Okay.
From 8 years. So what did you like about writing this novel from an adult perspective versus your last novel, which was written from a child? Was it easier or harder? You might want to repeat that.
Okay, I will repeat the question as it was read to me, which is what was enjoyable about writing this book as opposed to my first novel, which was written from the point of view of a child. So it was really fun to not have to write as a child for this book. It was enjoyable to be a 6-year-old girl for all that's bright and gone, and to get in her head and to really try to see things the way she saw things. But I myself am not a 6-year-old, and I have a lot more in common with Magda than I do with my previous main character, whose name was Aoife. And it was just a relief to be able to sort of share things that are true for me about knowing about birds or plants or caring about houses or history or poets, all of which are things that a 6-year-old wouldn't have cared about. And I always had to sort of restrict the language and make sure I wasn't using any words more than 2 syllables and no semicolons, and everything simple. So it was a joy to be able to write a character who's a little more mature and can use a semicolon when the occasion calls for it.
And Sarah wrote or asked, did the characters take on a life of their own as you wrote, or did they tell you what they wanted to hear?
Okay, the question was, did the characters take on a life of their own as I wrote, or did they tell me what to do? I always hear authors say that, and I'm like, what are you talking about? Don't you use an outline? I use an outline. I tell the characters what to do. So maybe that makes me a less authentic writer than somebody who's truly intuitive in the sense of progressing through the book. But especially when you're writing a thriller or mystery, I think it's helpful to have a plan. So the characters always feel very real to me, but I don't think that they take over the story the way I hear other people describe it. I think that I more strongly associate with people who say, like, every character in the book is you, like you're the villain, you're the victim, you're the heroine. I think there's something true about that. I suppose that's the egotism of the author. But I feel more like they're all me than that they're coming to life and I can't control them necessarily. There's always a few surprises as you write, but I don't feel like they take over the book.
Diana, did your love of New Orleans help inspire you to incorporate the hurricane story?
I have been to New Orleans with a friend named Diane, who's probably asking that question. Did my love of New Orleans affect this book? I don't think it did. I came to Key West and was really inspired by Key West. I have a separate story that's set in New Orleans that I think is going to have a New Orleans influence. I do love New Orleans. A lot of people know me know that that's my favorite city and I love the food and I'm there a lot. Wait, shoot, I just said it's my favorite city and I'm in Key West. What was I thinking? It is my second favorite city after Key West. If it's Thursday, I must be in Florida. My second favorite city. But what I love about New Orleans is sort of the sense of magic and literally you feel that there are spells being cast. And I don't get that about Key West. What I get is the freshness, the nature, the birds, the plants here, the architecture here. There are similarities in architecture, and a few times there's connections with New Orleans between Key West and New Orleans because the steamships were headed to New Orleans when they were wrecked, and some of that wreckage became part of Key West history. You guys had no idea what you were in for with that question, Diane. So no, I wouldn't say that New Orleans inspired this book, but a future book it will. Okay, the question was, who were the influences on the poet character, Isabel Reyes, who you heard just a little bit about in that reading? And is there poetry in the book? So the inspiration for the fictitious poet that I used instead of Hemingway I was inspired by the Hemingway house and the Hemingway caretakers, but I didn't want Hemingway as my artist because he's such a manly, virile, sparse character. He didn't inspire me in the same way. So there's a female poet in my book who died in the late 20s by suicide and is a very mysterious romantic character. And I've been describing her as a cross between Emily Dickinson and Sylvia Plath. So she's sort of this reclusive, mysterious character. I think the poetry I was thinking of was probably Emily Dickinson's, but Sylvia Plath also has this like tragedy that's embedded in her story now, which is really annoying to people who love Sylvia Plath because you can love those books and the poems that she wrote and not feel that they're shadowed by her personal life story and what happened to her in the end of her life. But for the average person, that's mostly what people would say about Sylvia Plath and Hemingway, to be fair. And so some of that tension is in this book, where my main character, Magda, wants Isabel's poetry to be recognized, but the sort of larger than life story of Isabel's life and death has sort of overshadowed the poetry. And that's kind of what everybody knows. The house is creepy. A suicide happened there. Suicide still happened there, like a famous romantic suicide. What was the second part of the poetry question? Oh, there is poetry in the book, and I'm not a poet myself, so I had a poetry consultant, Sandra Beasley, help me with the poetry, which is great. I wrote it. She did not write it. I'm sure she would want me to say that, but I hired her. I knew her from Washington, D.C. She's a real poet as a profession. She teaches poetry and also has several wonderful books out. Sandra Beasley is her name. And so I hired her to help me make the poetry better. And I knew she would do a great job because she also has a strong interest in historical poetry and the different poetic themes of the time. It can be difficult to base your poems on Emily Dickinson. That's not the right era that Isabel Reyes would have been writing in. So she wouldn't quite have, she would have different influences. And so Sandra helped me with that. And she did a great job. And her suggestions definitely improved the poetry. I swear there is not a complete poem in the book. There's just little fragments and titles and, you know, tiny little evocative pieces of lines because I would not subject you, my loving readers, who are presumably here to read a mystery/thriller, maybe Southern Gothic book, depending on who you talk to, but not a poetry book. So there is no full poetry in the book. I'm going to drink this coconut.
We have had a couple of questions about what's in the book.
It is coconut water. Thank you. Yes. Can you see? There's a very bright light. You can't really see in there. It is coconut water. That is all I will say on camera. Well, people who have seen me on social media or seen any of the other interviews I've given know that I always write too short. My books are always too short. And that's partly why I have outline, is to try to help me get longer and not get too short. I think of a really great idea, maybe one really good twist and a great ending, and we're done, except we are not done because that is not novel length. So that absolutely happened with this book too. I had a first draft that I liked, and I thought there was a lot that was working. That it was only about 50,000 words, and I needed to go back and do the middle again and do a lot more in the middle and have more crime solving, more clues, more mystery, and really spool that out. And that's always difficult for me because I know the answer already, maybe because of my outline. So I never want to waste readers' time there. I feel like I've given you essential clues and the ending, and that just doesn't a novel make. So I always have to go back, and that's always the hardest part because you can lose all the energy there if you're not careful, and it can start to sag. And so you have to sort of think of really great, exciting things to happen. This one was a little better than most because it is based on a thriller. So in the whole second half, the idea is just keep cranking up the intensity. So every time the worst thing that can happen is what happens. So if they've found supplies and they're looking good in the storm, you know those supplies, no spoilers, but are probably not going to work out for them because in the second half, it's just getting worse and worse and worse, which is based on people's experience in hurricanes too. Sometimes the back end is worse than the front. So always the hardest is the middle. That is a good question. Well, this year I gave myself the gift of stepping away from my previous full-time job and taking on a part-time job and freelance instead, because I really wanted to focus on writing, which anybody who cares about writing will say is a bad idea. Do not do that. Do not do that. There is no money in writing. No, no. But I just felt like I owed it to myself to try to put everything into my second book. I had sold my first one and it had been somewhat more successful than I had dreamed, which isn't saying that much, but is, when you're a nobody and, anything happens with your first book, you're very excited. And so I had the potential to sell a second book based on that if I was quick enough, if I didn't linger. No, it wasn't going to have 3 years or 5 years. My first book took 7 years to write. This one took 5. So you see, I'm getting way better. And it wasn't finished, and I felt like the time was running out, and I felt like as long as I was working, I was not going to be able to finish it and not have it be as good as I wanted it to be, and I was going to lose this opportunity. And I was just like, I'm going to leap, I could always go back and get another full-time job. I mean, that didn't turn out to be true because there was a global pandemic and the economy was actually pretty rocky. So it was a tough time to launch a freelance/part-time career, as it turns out, but I did not know that. That was as I was sort of revising this book. And it has been a journey, but I think I'm proud of myself that I did it, that I prioritized this despite finances and despite everything else. That's also, of course, a huge privilege to be able to do. But I felt that I could do it and finish this book. Will there ever be any other books? I don't know. That's not up to me, in the world of publishing. That's not up to me. There is a little piece of that. I try to keep those separate as much as I can. I think being somebody who works in the environmental sector and who cares about that kind of stuff, it always appears in the books, even if you think it doesn't. I mean, I had a question from a guy doing an interview of my first book being like, why are there so many plants and animals in this book? And I was like, in the first one? Shoot, the first one's set in Detroit. There's not even that many plants or animals, but I think it just came through anyway. Like I couldn't help describing the animals and plants and setting outside and the park and things like that. So I'm careful not to do the Ayn Rand, this is John Galt, stop the action and for 3 chapters talk about climate change in the Keys. It's in there, just a hint that she points out that there's been more storms, and she's sort of thinking about the future of the Keys. I think the reason I was inspired by the Keys when I come here is because they are so fragile, and they might not be here forever, and none of us know how to deal with that, which New Orleans experiences too. And I live in the Chesapeake, and there's a lot of changes in the Chesapeake going on all the time, and I don't think any of us have come to terms with the fact that some of the places that we go all the time and that we love are at real threat of just not being around in the future. And I'm thinking of Annapolis and DC and places on the Eastern Shore that I've loved. And so that was definitely in my mind when I set this book here. The Keys are quite flat, and obviously they're in the middle of the water. A big hurricane has not completely destroyed them or overtopped them. Irma missed. So, I mean, it didn't miss, it impacted, but it did not erase everything on the Keys the way some of the catastrophic forecasts did. So does that mean that the next one will miss and they'll always miss? I don't know. I think I was wrestling with that. So it's in there more as subtext than at any point there's a long pause where I talk about human contributed global emissions or factories. That never comes in, but it underlines the book, I think, and a lot of my books. There's a implication that nature is fragile and that we're all trying to figure out how to handle that. And then it's time for the giveaway. You're not going to get this coconut though. That's for me.
So the question is, can you tell us more about any books you have in progress, and I'll add on to that.
Yes, what authors are reading. That's always the hard question. Yes, so it's difficult in the world of publication. I don't have a deal for a future book, so there may not be a third book. I'm working on drafts of things, and one of them, my agent will tell me if it's any good or not. I might get the thumbs down. So these things are not up to me. This may be the end of Eliza Nellums. Is this the end of our brave heroine? but I'm working on a project that's about birds and mystery, and it will be another mystery and smuggling. I think I would set it in my own backyard this time, in part because I was writing the next one during the pandemic, so I couldn't travel to Key West or start a new book or anything. So something close to home. And if it will come out, I don't know. So watch this space. There will be announcements if there is, and if there's not, there won't be. And as long as I breathe, I hope. So there could be a future book, if not that one, another one. There's nothing I could do. But elizanellums.com would tell you if there was going to be a future book. And what was the next question? What am I reading? So I am in the middle of H is for Hawk right now. It came out like 5 years ago, and I meant to read it then. And then now the same author has a new book, Vesper Flights. That's Helen McDonald is the author. And I am loving it. It is so gentle and calm and soothing. It was very popular at the time, and I'm really heartened by that because it's got a lot of facts in it. It's a lot of birds. It's a little slow moving. They haven't found a corpse yet. It's really weird. I'm like halfway through it. I don't think anyone's gonna get whacked. But I'm just loving it, and so that's what I'm reading right now. And I will then go to her next one. Two other books I would recommend right now are. S.A. Crosby has a book, Razorblade Tears. I'm seeing a nod. It's so good. I'm loving it. It's about two ex-cons whose gay sons are murdered. And so the two ex-cons, the sort of unlikely duo who had their own difficulties with the sons, each of them had differently troubled relationships with the sons, then sort of have to come together and avenge this terrible murder, which is just very well written. He's a great author. He's funny on Twitter too, which if you can pull that off. And the other one is PJ Vernon, Bathhouse. And I've just started it. He is great. It's a thriller. It's a tight thriller with sort of like lots of twists and turns. And you think you know what's happening and you don't know what's happening. And so highly recommend. I haven't finished it, but I'm going to literally tonight. As soon as this party's over, I'm going to go back and finish that book because that's how compelling it is. I think that was the end of that question, right? Okay, so in the short time that we have left before we start the live party, I owe people a giveaway. I know why you're here, and it is not this coconut. Okay, so I have a copy of my first novel, All That's Bright and Gone. And selecting randomly, I will give it to Lucy Alvis. So if you can message either me at eliza.nellums@gmail.com or Books and Books at their contact information, which I think is on the Zoom invite, they will also send you an email with an address. I will mail you that book. I also have a hard copy of my new novel, The Bone Cay, and I will award that one to Jane Meckelson. So Jane Meckelson, you are our other lucky winner, and Lucy Alves. I believe that is all the time we have left. Thank you for joining me live from Key West. We're going to have a little reception after this, and I think that will be enjoyable also.